Previously on Rock the Dragon, a Dragon Ball Super podcast. After over 2 years and over 131 episodes, Tim Bridgewater's journey through Dragon Ball Super finally came to its epic conclusion. Then, in the year 2020, a pandemic brought the world to a standstill, and out of sheer boredom, Tim reawakened the podcast from quarantine to answer questions, talk about other non-Dragon Ball related topics, and hopefully provide some entertainment for other bored listeners of the podcast. In December of that year, Tim once again bid the podcast farewell, and silence reigned for almost 2 entire years. When the news of a new Dragon Ball Super movie was announced, Tim was revived with the Dragon Balls, and then returned to talk about and review that movie in September 2022. Fast forward to over 2 years later, a new Dragon Ball show is announced. After some careful thought, Tim was summoned once again to talk about this new show. But is he in over his head? Maybe he sucks now. Maybe this new show will suck. Maybe he'll realize it was all a big waste of his time. But one thing's for sure, there'll be some fun along the way. And of course, there's the big question. Does anyone still give a shit? Find out now. Rock the Dragon, a Dragon Ball Daima podcast. Here we go again. What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 0 of Rock the Dragon, a Dragon Ball Daima podcast. That's right. Let me rewind because there were 2 things that I said there that might sound a little bit strange. It definitely feels strange saying them out loud. The first is that I said episode 0. And then the second thing is that I said Rock the Dragon, a Dragon Ball Daima podcast. This is episode 0 of my brand new podcast where, of course, I'm going to talk about Dragon Ball Daima. Now, if you are someone who is just discovering me and my podcasting for the first time and you're wondering why I'm talking about all this shit regarding episode 0s and etc., is because most of you who are going to hear this are obviously familiar with me from my previous podcast, which was called Rock the Dragon, a Dragon Ball Super podcast. Of course, that is a podcast that I hosted for over 2 years, where I covered every single episode of Dragon Ball Super. And I'm just going to say this right now before I get too much further into this. If I accidentally say Dragon Ball Daima when I'm referring to Super, please just forgive me for that, because now I have to keep these things together in my head, because now I have another podcast. So I could accidentally say the wrong name. But yeah, so obviously I talked about Dragon Ball Super over on that podcast. And there's a lot of episodes there. Not only did I cover every single episode of Dragon Ball Super, from episode 1 all the way to episode 131, where I did in-depth reviews of every single episode. Eventually, I started taking emails over there for my email segment called What Are You Saying? I had to remember what it was called for a second. And then it kind of grew into a show where I was able to do a lot of cool things and have a lot of fun conversation with other Dragon Ball fans. And I would take emails and I would read reviews, and we did a lot. We did a lot as a fan community, as friends, as Dragon Ball lovers, through the course of that podcast. And not everything was love. Sometimes there was some hate. You know, I don't think there's any question that Dragon Ball Super was a pretty divisive sort of a show. I mean, some people loved it, some people hated it. I very much had a love-hate relationship with Dragon Ball Super. Of course, I'm not going to talk too much about that show because I have an entire other podcast that I did where I covered, and you'll get every single thought I ever could possibly have had about that show on that podcast. Okay, but I'm just giving a little bit more context here for some new people that might be joining in, just to kind of get you guys caught up. But yes, that was a podcast that I did. In addition to, just talking about every single episode, I did some bonus episodes where I talked about some other things. I talked about some of the Dragon Ball movies over there. I did some quarantine bonus episodes. I did some Christmas episodes. There was a lot of stuff covered over the course of that. And I did an episode just as recently as today because I wanted to post one more episode over on that podcast so that the subscribers to that podcast would hopefully come over to this one. So it was more of an announcement sort of a episode where I was just letting everyone know, hey, I'm starting a new podcast. Come check it out if you plan on watching Dragon Ball Daima. I got a lot of love over on that podcast, and it wasn't always easy to do. I mean, it took a lot of work, a lot of effort. I'm hoping to simplify things for myself a lot more with this podcast. And also, as rumor has it, Dragon Ball Daima is not supposed to be as long of a show. This is supposed to be, and don't quote me on this because I have not been able to find any real confirmation on this one way or another, but it's supposed to, I guess, be about 20 episodes. So that means we've got about 20 episodes of this new podcast. Don't be surprised if I pop up with a bonus episode somewhere in there if I get inspired and I feel excited to do it. I hope you guys will stick with me. I hope all of my old listeners from that podcast will come join me here. I'd like to welcome anyone new who's just discovering me for the first time. Just to tell you a little bit more about me, of course, I hosted that podcast. I also hosted a podcast before that one called Republic City Report, which was a podcast that covered The Legend of Korra, which if you watched Avatar: The Last Airbender and you love that show, hopefully you watched the sequel to that, the sequel series called The Legend of Korra, where I also hosted a podcast where I reviewed that show. So if that's something you're just getting into, Avatar: The Last Airbender or The Legend of Korra, I have an entirely other podcast called Republic City Report that you can go and listen to, and it'll take you through not every single episode. I didn't start that podcast until book 2 of The Legend of Korra. So you can go and start with book 2, and then I'll take you through the rest of the series. This is obviously something that I've found some enjoyment in doing, and usually I find people that are for some reason interested in listening to me talk about this stuff. So I'm going to continue to do it. I want to thank everyone who left reviews for the previous podcast. Hopefully you would take the time to do the same for this one if you're enjoying it. If you're someone who was a regular listener of that podcast, which there are a lot of you guys, and you just want to help give me a little extra boost on Apple Podcasts or Spotify with this podcast, hey, leave a review now. You kind of know what to expect here. Speaking of, I want to take a moment to kind of talk about some of the things that you can expect here. If you listen to Rock the Dragon, a Dragon Ball Super podcast, see, I got to catch myself now. I can't just say Rock the Dragon anymore. I have to specify. The previous podcast, you know that I did an episode 0, right? And in that episode, I talked about a lot of stuff. But what I felt was most important about it is that I just want to talk about the kind of vibe you could expect on the podcast, a little bit about my knowledge of these topics. I talked a lot about Dragon Ball Z in that episode. I'm not going to talk a lot about Dragon Ball Z on this podcast unless I'm specifically asked about it, or if I need to make a reference of some sort to that show, which I feel like is pretty inevitable, But yeah, if you want to hear me talk about Dragon Ball Z, and I went through every single saga and gave my opinions on that in episode 0 of Rock the Dragon, a Dragon Ball Super podcast. So you can go check that out. And a lot of the things that I said there will also apply here. Just a few things to know about me in my podcast. This is not a news sort of a podcast. So if you're looking for Dragon Ball news, that's not really what I talk about here. That doesn't mean I won't talk about it from time to time. It just kind of depends on what the news is. But there are a lot of different outlets, especially on YouTube, where people just talk about news and rumors and that kind of stuff. And they'll talk about the manga and they'll talk about the video games. I mostly focus on the anime here. And most importantly, the English dub of the anime. Okay. I probably should have said this a lot sooner. Okay. But we're going to talk about the English dub here. Once again, I talk about a lot of this in episode 0 of my previous podcast, but I'm just a fan of the English dub. I grew up on the English dub, the Funimation dub, the Ocean dub, those were my dubs. I never really got into the subbed version on the Japanese versions. There's a lot of reasons for that. Once again, I talk about all of that in the other podcasts. I just prefer English. That's the language that I speak. And I prefer the American voices versus the Japanese voices. It's just an easier experience for me. So that's what I prefer. So I won't really talk about that version of it, which means another very, very important thing. I have not seen that version yet. I have not seen the subbed version of Dragon Ball Daima yet. Once again, listeners to my previous podcast already know these things, right? I don't watch the sub versions because I don't want to spoil I don't want to be spoiled for what's going to happen when the English dub finally arrives. Especially I'm going to talk about it on a podcast. I just want to sit here and watch the episodes fresh and not know what's going to happen if I can help it. So if you are someone who's watched the sub, because clearly the sub has been out for a couple months now, and you decide you want to listen to this podcast, then that's great. That happened all the time on the previous podcast as well. All I ask is that you don't send me any emails or anything like that with any spoilers in it if you already know what's going to happen. But it's totally fine if you want to email me at rockthedragon at, what is it? rockthedragonpodcast at gmail.com. Totally fine if you want to send me an email just asking my thoughts about certain things or etc. Sorry. I do have an email segment once again called What Are You Saying? You'll be able to email me at rockthedragonpodcast at gmail.com. I also have an Instagram for this podcast at rockthedragonpodcast. If you listen to the old podcast, there's a lot of talk about a Facebook page in there. That's old. There is no longer a Facebook page. Facebook deleted my page because I guess, I don't know, they found copyrighted content on there, which is funny now because I see that shit everywhere on Facebook. But for some reason, they picked on me. With that being said, I just said the word shit. Okay. This is also an explicit podcast. If you listen to Republic City Report, that podcast was not explicit because I didn't feel like that show. I didn't feel like the audience I didn't feel like my audience on that show would have wanted. It wasn't appropriate. I mean, that show was on Nickelodeon, and it was a sequel to Avatar: The Last Airbender, which was largely marketed as a kids show, but was definitely much more than that. Things are just different over here when we talk about Dragon Ball. You know, a lot of us fucking grew up on Dragon Ball. Like, you know, a lot of you guys are my age or a little bit younger now. So like we're all adults watching this for the most part. But if you have a young kid and you're into Dragon Ball Daima and you're a little bit cautious about the type of content and language that will be used here, it will be explicit. Now, it's not overkill, right? I mean, I'm sure you can tell that by now. I don't just start cussing up a storm for no reason, you know, but it does come out every now and then. So just be aware of that. But back, like I was saying before, this isn't a news sort of a thing. I'm not reporting any Dragon Ball news. So because of that, I don't necessarily fact check everything that I'm about to talk about. This was a subject that came up a few times on my other podcasts. I don't like to fact check things. I mean, mostly because a lot of times I don't know exactly what I'm going to talk about until I start talking about it. I have a very, very rough outline of the things I want to cover. And I mean rough. Nothing's in detail. I just come here and I sit down and I start talking. So a lot of times things that I didn't plan to talk about come up in conversation. So I don't have a chance to fact check them before I say it. So I'll try to be careful about it. And I'll try to say, correct me if I'm wrong. That's something you'll hear me say a lot. I'll say, correct me if I'm wrong, or maybe I'm not remembering this correctly, or maybe, don't quote me on this. Those are all things I'll say a lot. So if I happen to misspeak on something, it's because I didn't know or I made a mistake, which happens a lot too. When you're talking to yourself for an hour plus, sometimes you just say the wrong things by accident and you don't realize you said it. You know, I may say Goku's name when I meant to say Vegeta. That kind of shit happens. Hopefully there'll be enough context there though, so you know what I meant. Okay, so that happens occasionally. But I really did just want to revisit the whole aspect of saying this isn't a news sort of a thing. I'm not a big fact checker. You know, I had a couple of people write in about that and concerns about that in the past. I just want to make it clear from up front right now. I'm not going to go out of my way to say anything incorrect. I do feel like most of what I will say will be correct, but a lot of it's coming from memory. So it's possible that I'll misspeak on something every now and then. So just take it easy on me, okay? Take it easy on me. I just wanted to get a lot of that preliminary sort of stuff out of the way as I try to recover my speaking abilities after not podcasting for so long. Excuse me. So let's just talk a little bit about Dragon Ball Daima and what got me to this point. And I won't keep this part very long. But obviously, Dragon Ball Super came to an end. We had a movie called Dragon Ball Super Superhero. I even talked about that over there on that podcast as well. We didn't really have anything for a while. You know, there were a lot of rumors going around whether or not Dragon Ball Super was going to return as an anime. Because as most of us know, Dragon Ball Super as a manga continued well after the anime ended. So a lot of people were wondering, okay, when are we getting like season 2 or whatever of Dragon Ball Super? A lot of rumors, nothing came to fruition, nothing was accurate. All of a sudden, there's an announcement made that to celebrate, I forget the amount of years, but the anniversary of Dragon Ball, the original Dragon Ball, that they were going to do a new limited series called Dragon Ball Daima. So, of course, I got a few emails from listeners about it. I still follow Dragon Ball news somewhat, but not too much because I don't want to read spoilers. So it took me some time, and then and I've honestly been kind of quietly working on this in the background for the past couple months. I felt like I was going to want to do a podcast to talk about it, but I wasn't sure, and I didn't know all of the details yet. I mean, it was fucking difficult to find any information about this show. All they said for the longest time was that a new anime was coming, and then after that, they started to talk about, it's not even going to be on network TV. It's just going to go straight to streaming, which was interesting. And what was even more interesting than that is they announced that the dub was going to come along a lot sooner than what we're used to when it comes to getting the dubs of Dragon Ball related things. Obviously the English dub of Dragon Ball Z didn't really take off in the, until the early 2000s. And that was 15 years or so after it aired in Japan. So we're kind of used to getting this stuff late. And with Dragon Ball Super, I think Dragon Ball Super was out for over a year before we got the English dub. So when I started to cover that show with my podcast, as an English dub listener, we were already behind most of the world that had already been watching this show for a year at that point. But surprisingly, I still had plenty of English dub fans that came and found my podcast and wanted to listen to it and gave it a shot. So I gotta say, it's very, very refreshing that we're not that far behind here with the English dub. I mean, I think the sub has probably been out for about maybe 11 or 12 episodes or weeks so far. Don't quote me on that. Okay. But we've got the dub premiering this Friday, January 10th. So that was exciting to find out as well. And then finding out where it was going to air. What streaming services it was going to be on. They announced pretty early on it's going to be on Crunchyroll. But then we also found out it was also going to be on Netflix. And then I've just found out today that it's also on Hulu already. So very, very tricky, right? It's kind of hard. I don't know exactly when I'm going to be watching these episodes or on what streaming service yet. Because if it's going to do like it's currently doing, where it's going to air a new episode on Crunchyroll and then a week later air that same episode on Netflix, because I believe that's what it's doing now, then I don't know if I'm just going to wait, because I don't have Crunchyroll. Okay. I don't know how many of you guys have Crunchyroll, but I don't have Crunchyroll. I do have Netflix though. So am I going to wait that extra week to watch it, which would make the podcast come out technically a week later or so after, it hits Crunchyroll? Or will I get Crunchyroll so I can be a little bit more timely about it? I feel like that's going to be the right answer, because we're already behind as dub watchers, and I don't want to necessarily be too much further behind than necessary. So I think I'm going to get Crunchyroll. Okay. So but as far as what day the podcast is going to be updated and uploaded, listeners of my previous podcast already know that can change from week to week, just depending on what I have going on. This isn't my full-time job or anything. Okay. I never made any money doing the previous podcast. I didn't have any ads or anything like that on there. There's a possibility with this podcast that may change. I may look into some things like that, but right now it's kind of early to talk about that because I don't know if anyone's even going to fucking listen to this. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see if people listen. And if people start to listen, future episodes, there may be some ads on there, because in order for me to get back into this, it has to be, it has to be worth it for me. I can't spend so much of my free time doing this kind of thing because it takes a lot. And my day job, is not completely cutting it right now. So if I can somehow get some support from you guys through doing this, then I'll gladly take it. So stay tuned for a few more announcements regarding all of that kind of stuff as the situation develops. But yes, that brings us here to Dragon Ball Daima. Okay. Which, we're going to talk more about it in a minute, but I just want to give a little bit of a history of why this is happening. I just decided, I'll talk about it. Why not? Okay. Now I want to back up a minute here because I talked about, it's been a hell of a couple of years since that last episode of Rock the Dragon. I'm not going to get into Rock the Dragon, a Dragon Ball Super podcast. I'm not going to get into too much detail about my personal life and things like that. If anyone has any questions about that, you guys can ask and I'll gladly talk about it. But certainly, last year, we lost Akira Toriyama. So I couldn't dive this far into this episode without talking about that or addressing that. Toriyama-san, he's gone. As most of us know, he passed away. I think it was March of last year. I'm not going to get into a whole thing about it because honestly, there's not much to say in regards to, because this guy was clearly very, very private. It seems like there's only a handful of photos and videos of him out there. I don't know if that was just intentional because he just didn't want to be known. He didn't want to be in the spotlight. But obviously, this man was responsible for creating one of the greatest animated shows of all time, in my opinion, Dragon Ball Z. And, my love for this world is I can't even begin to explain the impact that Dragon Ball Z has had on my life. You know what I mean? I'm still talking about it to this day. I have a tattoo on my arm of Shenron and all 7 Dragon Balls. Look, you guys already know, okay? Because most of you are coming over from the previous podcast. Clearly, I'm a massive fan of all of this stuff. We wouldn't have any of it if it wasn't for him. So rest in peace to Toriyama. I just wanted to say that because I didn't really get to comment on it because I wasn't doing the podcast at the time. But I didn't want to not acknowledge that. We also lost someone else last year in 2024, and that was my man Doc Harris. Now, I don't know how many people are familiar with Doc Harris, depending on which version of Dragon Ball Z you watched. Maybe you know his voice, maybe you don't. Doc Harris was the narrator for the Ocean dub of Dragon Ball Z. And if you're asking yourself, what's the Ocean dub? Look, I talk about all of it in episode 0 of my previous podcast. I go into it, I explain the whole thing. Okay. But if for me, that was the first version of Dragon Ball Z I was exposed to. So that was a version that I really, really liked a lot. Completely different actors, completely different music, completely different narration. Doc Harris was the one who really kind of started this whole, previously on Dragon Ball Z, that was him, what are Goku and Vegeta gonna eat for dinner tonight? Stay tuned. That was him. You know what I think I'm gonna do here is I'm actually just gonna play a clip of Doc Harris so that if some of you are kind of confused, you'll hear it and it'll immediately take you back to a better time.
Sensing that things had gone awry, Gohan and Krillin raced toward the battlefield as Goku began his bid for survival. In a desperate yet brilliant move, Goku used the solar flare to buy himself the precious time needed to form the Spirit Bomb. But look out, Goku. Oh no, the Spirit Bomb was dispersed and Goku's hopes for victory crushed, but not extinguished. Hang on, Goku, there's help on the way. But is it too late? What can be done? You can run if you want to, but if you're brave, stay tuned. Goku and Vegeta lock horns in the battle of the century. Next time on Dragon Ball Z.
Now, if you're like me, okay, you just heard that and you immediately start to feel really, really nostalgic for that voice, because that voice was the voice that led every episode of Dragon Ball Z and ended every episode of Dragon Ball Z for when many of us got into it for the first time. So what a great voice, what a great talent. I mean, what an incredible, just the delivery, the way that he really, really got into it with the way he was saying those words and just bringing you into it, and just you could feel the emotion in it, and it was suspense and it was tension, and it's just a great, excellent narration. So rest in peace to Doc Harris, man. A big part of a lot of our I'm not going to say my childhood, because I wasn't necessarily a child when I started watching Dragon Ball Z. I was in high school, but yeah, I mean, some people would consider that a kid. I was definitely really, really young. So definitely an incredible contribution to my initial experience with that show. And, a lot of people kind of get Doc Harris's voice confused with Kyle Aber's voice, because Kyle Aber later did the narration for the Funimation dub of Dragon Ball Z. Unless I'm mistaken. Okay. Sure. Could I just stop right now and Google it? Yeah, but that's no fun. Look, I feel like that's accurate. And it's also not a coincidence that those voices kind of sound alike, right? Which is, I'm not surprised that some people have gotten those mistaken, because, the Funimation dub was under strict, very much, orders, for lack of a better term. The Funimation actors, Sean Schemmel, Christopher Sabat, those guys, people we know and love, initially they were trying to they were told and directed to try to copy the previous actors, right? They didn't want anyone to notice that there was a difference in voices, thus taking people out of the experience. So when the Ocean dub actors were no longer needed and Funimation decided they wanted to do their own dub, they hired all these new actors and they were told to try to sound like the other actors. So I don't even know if you can find this now or not. I don't know. I don't know if you can find the original Funimation dub, because now they've gone back and they've redone everything. They've redone the entire dub a few times now, I think, for different reasons, whether that be for Dragon Ball Z Kai, which I'll talk about in a second, as well. But yeah, so that's probably why people make that mistake, right? Because they were trying to sound like the previous actors at first, until they kind of grew into their own thing, and then they became much more known for those voices. So then they were able to just kind of make them their own, and that's when they went back and decided to re-record everything with those current voices. Anyway, R.I.P. Doc Harris, a powerful contribution to my initial introduction to Dragon Ball Z. There's a couple other things I want to touch upon here before we go back to Daima. And that is, I mentioned a second ago, Dragon Ball Z Kai. Now, I had many of you guys over the course of the previous podcast ask me about my thoughts about Dragon Ball Z Kai. And a lot of you guys made recommendations and said I should watch it. You gave your opinions on it, your thoughts, etc. I never had any real opinions on it because I hadn't seen it at that point. One of the things I remember saying about it, though, was that first of all, just a quick little aside, just in case you're not familiar with Dragon Ball Z Kai, this is a version of Dragon Ball Z that was done some years later it was an attempt to make Dragon Ball Z, the anime, a lot more like the manga, meaning cutting out a lot of the filler episodes, a lot of those moments where they just kind of stand there and talk and nothing happens. They cut all that stuff out. They added some additional animation. There's different music, and there's also, in some cases, there are different voice actors than the standard Funimation dub. Dragon Ball Z Kai was still done by Funimation. It's just, it was done much later, so some of the original actors weren't available, or they didn't want them anymore, or they moved on, or etc. But for the most part, the main actors are there. Gohan specifically had a different voice in Kai. Frieza had a different voice in Kai. We'll come back around to Gohan and his voice in a second when we talk about Daima and the current voice for Kid Goku. Okay. Ooh, there's a lot to talk about here. But yes, so, Kai was a version that they cut out a lot of filler. And I know I'm going through a lot of stuff, and a lot of my regular listeners are like, Tim, we know all of this, man. Get to the point. Just bear with me, guys, because I'm trying, just in case someone's hearing this, just in case this is their first time hearing me talk about this stuff. I'm trying to cover all my bases here. I won't be this long-winded in other episodes, but this is episode 0. So I got to kind of assume that there are people listening to me for the first time. So Kai, yeah, that's what Kai is, a fillerless, shorter version. I think they cut somewhere over 100 episodes, I think, from the original Dragon Ball Z run out. So if you watch Dragon Ball Z, there's a lot of episodes that don't have anything to do with the main plot for the most part. It's Bulma doing some silly shit somewhere for the entire episode. It's Goku and Piccolo driving a car, getting a driver's license, stuff like that. So this version doesn't have any of that stuff, in addition to the other things that I mentioned. But one thing I did say pertaining to Kai on the previous podcast is that I had no interest in watching it because I'm in love with the original Funimation dub of Dragon Ball Z, even with the filler in it. I love it. So I just feel like if I watch a version where you cut stuff out, I'm just not going to like it as much. So, I decided sometime early last year, 2024, to watch Kai. Because I was thinking about watching just my version of Dragon Ball Z again, because I try to rewatch Dragon Ball Z every couple of years because, it's a great show. But I said, you know what? I'm going to watch Kai because I have Hulu and Dragon Ball Z Kai is on there. I'm like, you know what? Maybe now's the time to check out Kai after all my listeners telling me all this time that I should give it a shot. And I did. And look, I'll say this. I enjoyed Kai. I thought it was perfectly fine for what it was. There was definitely some weird stuff in there, and especially as someone who has watched the original version of the Funimation dub so many times, it was weird watching Kai for me because, I can usually quote the scenes and everything like that, and all of a sudden the dialogue's kind of different in some places. They're cutting stuff out, and it's a weird watch if you're so used to watching the other version. If you're watching Dragon Ball Z for the first time and you watch Kai, I would assume it would be a pretty decent experience for you. But that's just not the context of which I was watching it in. I'm watching it knowing that I've already seen the other version 1,000,000 times. So every time they skipped something or something wasn't in there, I didn't like it. And I just kind of felt like that was going to happen regardless. So I'm not going to do a big review of Dragon Ball Z Kai. I'm just going to say I appreciate the fact that they made it. There are definitely some improvements in some places with the animation and clearing some things up and some things happening a little faster, a little quicker, a little cleaner. Some of the voice work is better because those actors over time became better voice actors. So now all of a sudden they're just doing better jobs. They're more passionate about it because now they've owned these characters, right? Now they know these characters so well that they know they can do it better. So there was some stuff like that happening in there. But overall, I'm always going to prefer the original version because I want that version. You know, it's just like, once again, also Dragon Ball, I mentioned this. Kai also has different music. Well, if you listen to my previous podcast, you know how much I love the Bruce Faulconer score. I mean, nothing's going to top that for me. And I know that in Kai, the music was supposed to be more in line with the original version of Dragon Ball Z, the Japanese dub, not the Japanese dub, the sub, I don't know how much of that was that, and that's totally fine. The fact that we have multiple different versions to watch, I think is cool, but I'm always going to prefer the OG, baby. My OG. Okay. So I did want to touch on that a little bit because I did watch it and I just felt like it was worth mentioning here now that I'm talking about Dragon Ball stuff again. Now, with that being said, when I was talking about Kai, I mentioned that Gohan's voice actor was different in Kai. In Kai, I don't know the details about this because I don't keep up with all the drama and shit, surrounding Dragon Ball, and some of you guys probably know. But an actress by the name of Colleen Clinkenbeard took over for the voice of Gohan in Kai, and pretty much everything after that. So that includes a lot of the video games too. If you're playing Dragon Ball Fighters or you play Dragon Ball Z, Kakarot, or a lot of the other games, Gohan's Kid Gohan and Teen Gohan were voiced by a different voice actress than most of us who watched the original Funimation dub were used to. And that was an actress by the name of Stephanie Naldony. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. I've always said Naldony. I feel like that. For some reason, I'm just now wondering, maybe I'm not pronouncing that right. Well, my apologies to her if she hears this. But Colleen Clinkenbeard took over for that. And I would say, I guess, mixed reactions as far as I can tell. I didn't hear that voice a lot because I didn't watch Kai until like last year. But I did know that when I was playing the video games that all of a sudden Gohan had a different voice. So now coming back around to Daima, one of the main things that I think stood out to a lot of people when the English voice cast for Daima was revealed is that Stephanie Naldony has returned to the role of Kid Goku. I know we were talking about Gohan because I think she's much more known for Gohan, but she also voiced Kid Goku in Dragon Ball, the original Dragon Ball, once they went back and redubbed that. You're not going to hear me talk about Dragon Ball very much here because I haven't watched it. Not the entire series. I've seen some of it, but not the entire series. So one of the points of excitement that I noticed when Dragon Ball Daima was coming back to the forefront was that everyone seemed to be excited that Stephanie Naldony was returning to voice Kid Goku. And I love her voice. I'm always going to associate that voice with Gohan more so, but it's the familiarity that's associated with it. So I can't wait to see what she does in Daima as Kid Goku. That being said, that brings us back to the main reason we are here, and that is Dragon Ball Daima. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about that and what you can expect from this podcast as we dive more deeply into that show. Obviously, one of the most striking things that was revealed about Dragon Ball Daima when it was announced and the synopsis came out was that most of our cast was going to be turned into kids in this show. Whew. Okay, right? I think we were all stressed out when they made that announcement. I don't think it was just me. I think a lot of us was stressed the hell out, right? Because I think most of us did not want to hear that they were going to turn anyone into kids again, because it immediately reminded us of the last time they did that. And that was a little show called Dragon Ball GT, of which clearly I'm just bringing it up for the first time this entire podcast. And the reason for that is because it's largely known and accepted that Dragon Ball GT was not a very good show. And I didn't really like it, although I have seen all of it, and I also own it on VHS. Because when it originally aired on TV, I didn't know I wasn't going to like it, right? So I just started buying all the tapes so I can get ahead and all that kind of stuff on it. As a matter of fact, I think it was only available on VHS initially when it was released. I don't even think Dragon Ball GT aired on Cartoon Network until well after it was already out on VHS. Correct me if I'm wrong though, but because for some reason I bought all the VHS tapes instead of just watching it on TV. But GT wasn't a great show, okay? And notoriously in that show, they turned Goku into a kid. And that's not the entire reason that the show sucked, but it didn't help anything, right? And I think that show gets a lot of blame because of the fact they turned Goku back into a kid, even though it's possible to do that right. Like, I mean, you know, turning him back into a kid doesn't necessarily mean something's going to suck. It's all about how they handle it. It's all about how they write it. It's all about how it affects the story, if it makes sense. If they're doing it for cheap purposes, you know, which from what I understand, they just did it because they wanted to remind people of the original Dragon Ball. So they turned Goku into a kid again. Our concerns, understandably so, with Dragon Ball Daima is that maybe they're doing that again, right? But they're also not being secretive about it, right? Because I believe this series is being created in part to celebrate the original Dragon Ball, the anniversary of it. So we'll see. You know what I mean? I noticed a lot of people were feeling some type of way about that, and so was I. And I'm like, man, they're gonna turn them into kids. Why? You know. But the other part of me is excited because we've basically seen Kid Goku a million times at this point, but we have not seen a Kid Piccolo, a Kid Vegeta, a Kid Android 18. You know, so I think it'll be a very, very interesting, you know, dynamic to see what they do with that, and if it's done in a way that it is being utilized properly, and if it makes sense, and if it's fun to watch. Those of you who have been watching the sub already know the answer to that, but this is for those of us who haven't watched it yet, and we're going to see it for the first time in, you know, a couple of days. They're not going to be kids the entire series. You know, the trailer reveals that much. With that being said, I should probably talk about the trailer a little bit. I'm just going to pull it up so I can look at it as I talk about it. Certainly we have some incredible animation to look forward to with this series. I think a part of it being a limited series, probably means they were able to allocate the budget more effectively and just kind of give the full effort to this thing. Not to mention that after Dragon Ball Superhero came out, I think the expectations for Dragon Ball animation just kind of went up a lot higher, you know, because obviously Dragon Ball Super was notoriously known early on for having terrible animation in some of the episodes, of which they went back later and corrected. That doesn't seem like that's going to be a problem here. It seems like they got their shit together when it comes to Daima, because I'm looking at this stuff and this looks incredible. I mean, this looks like, you know, movie level quality, like the big screen level animation. Looks incredible. We get a shot of all of our heroes, you know, as kids, and they don't try to hide it. They just give it to you up front. Hey, this is what you can expect here. Okay. But they also show adult Goku and adult Vegeta. So we know at the very least, we're going to see them as adults before they're turned back into kids. And I would assume, you know, by the end of it, they're going to obviously be returned back to their adult versions, because from what I understand of this, Dragon Ball Daima is going to take place during a very sort of specific time in the Dragon Ball Z timeline. So this does not take place, unless I'm mistaken. Remember, yes, could I just Google these kinds of things? I can, but it's so hard to not see spoilers by mistake when you Google stuff. So a lot of the fact checking that I could do, I don't do because I don't want to see a spoiler. But from what I understand, this takes place during a very, very specific period within Dragon Ball Z and happens before Super. Okay. So yeah. Okay. So animation is looking excellent. We're going to be introduced to a lot of new characters here. Obviously, there's some ties here to Majin Buu because we're seeing some characters that look like they're from his world or tribe or whatever you want to call it. Babidi. You know, there's some characters that kind of reflect that aesthetic. There's a lot of Supreme Kai here. We know at the very least we're going to be going into the demon realm, as the little synopsis here says. Goku and company were living peaceful lives when they suddenly turned small due to a conspiracy. When they discover that the reason for this may lie in a world known as the demon realm, a mysterious young Majin named Glorio appears before them. Okay, so I can tell you a couple things I like about this a lot just based on reading that synopsis. Yeah, the part about them being turned into kids is kind of, crazy, whatever the hell. But part of the mystery of the show will be finding out why, and what the purpose of it is. And clearly there's a conspiracy happening here. So we'll be able to find out, hopefully there's an intriguing mystery that happens there with a nice reveal. Not only that, we're going into the demon realm, which I'm not sure that we've ever been there. I mean, we've seen, don't quote me on this, because we've seen a lot of locations in Dragon Ball. And I'm not sure if this is the same place that Deborah is from. Maybe it is, but it would make sense tying in to Babidi and his connection to Babidi and Majin Buu and all that kind of stuff. But they specifically mention here a mysterious young Majin. Well, we know Majin Buu, right? So we know there's going to be some development, some character development, some explanation, some exploration of that aspect of the Dragon Ball world. And I think that that's great, because one thing that Dragon Ball overall as a franchise has done a fairly poor job at is fleshing out the world, making it feel big, expansive, making it feel like, this is a fully developed, fleshed out world. They did more of that in Super by introducing all these other planets and these other gods and universes and stuff. You could even argue maybe they did a little bit too much, but I like the fact that they're going back to something they had already introduced in Dragon Ball Z and giving us more information on that before they started going to other planets and other realms, the way they did in Super. So I'm going to say this. I'm excited. I like everything that I've seen here. Once again, not thrilled about the fact that they've been turned into kids, but as long as they handle it properly and it's funny and it's interesting, then, it's not going to bother me too much. Okay. We all know that the Dragon Ball world that we all knew and loved with Dragon Ball Z, it's just gone now. I mean, it's over. It's never going to be that good again. It's never going to be quite like that again. It's never going to have that tone again. I hope that I'm wrong. But back when Dragon Ball Z was around and there were stakes and people actually died and people got killed and there were limbs being ripped off and you were scared and there was real tension and there was real suspense and transformations actually meant something. Power levels meant something. When people transformed, you felt it because it happened for the good, for good reasons for the most part, with the exception of Goten and Trunks, little Trunks. But I think all of that stuff is just gone because we watched Super and most of that stuff that I just listed just wasn't there. It just wasn't present in Super. So I'm not expecting it to be present in Daima. a show where they all get turned into kids. I'm expecting it to be even more kid friendly, with even less violence and less blood, or no blood. Dragon Ball Super didn't have any blood, so I'm not expecting any of that here. So I'm going to give this a much more of a fair shot than I think I gave Dragon Ball Super, because Super was coming off the heels of GT and Z, which for the most part looked a certain way and still had a similar tone and style with the violence and that kind of stuff. But now, since we have Super, my expectations are a lot lower, to be honest with you. I'm hoping it's great. I'm excited about it, but I'm not expecting as much as I was expecting from Super. Okay, so I guess in a couple days we'll find out. I think that about does it for everything I wanted to go into on this episode. I didn't realize I was going to end up talking about it for 50 minutes, but I did feel like it was important to have an episode 0 to kind of set the stage for this new podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed that. I hope you give me a rating, please. Hopefully 5 stars. Okay. I wouldn't be asking for it if I didn't think or hope it was going to be a good one. And go ahead and leave me a review. I know some of you guys probably haven't heard enough to be able to make your mind up on me yet, but a lot of you guys listened to me talk for so many other episodes. So if you be willing to share the love for this new podcast as well, I'd appreciate it. This podcast is going to be available for sure on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. There were a bunch of other outlets that my previous podcast ended up on, but that's not because I submitted them. It's just because some of these outlets would just grab your RSS feed and they'll just put it on their platform. And since I wasn't making any money from the podcast or anything anyway, I just didn't care. I'm going to be a little bit more particular about this podcast and where it ends up. And the feed is different than it was before for the previous podcast. So you shouldn't be able to find this podcast on any random website. This is probably mostly going to be on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. I mean, that's just, most people use those services to listen. If there's one that you listen to more that you like and you think is great and you like me to put it on there, I can look into that. I can look into it. Obviously, I want to get this out to as many people as possible. Hopefully you guys will help me do that by sharing it with your friends, talking about it. Please take your time. Please take the time to go to Instagram and look up Rock the Dragon Podcast on Instagram. A lot of the information regarding this podcast is going to be there because it's not a Facebook page anymore and I don't have a website for it. Okay. So just go follow me on Instagram, and I wanted, and I don't hold me to this, but I'm really considering introducing a video aspect to the podcast. So if you guys are familiar with Reels on Instagram, I may start posting those little clips of me recording the podcast, talking about it, getting video a little bit more involved here than it was previously with the previous podcast. Of course, I still also have a YouTube channel. Okay, so it's just youtube.com/@RockTheDragonPodcast, I believe. It's been pretty inactive, but I'm hoping to build that back up again with some new content. If you haven't had a chance to see the old content, go check it out. Everything's still there. I did make some videos during the course of the previous podcast, so all that stuff is still there, including some really cool stuff that I did for the 100th anniversary episode, that I did on that podcast. Hoping to get that YouTube channel back active again with new stuff regarding this podcast. So please go subscribe to it. I also had a Patreon at one point. I had to let the Patreon go because I just didn't have enough support on the Patreon. Perhaps I will consider bringing a Patreon back if the support is there. If the interest is there, if the numbers are there, etc. I'll be paying a lot more attention to that kind of stuff now that I'm using a different, podcast host. I'll be able to kind of do some things before that I wasn't really able to do. I think I talked about everything. Okay, so what do you think about any of that? What do you think about all of that? What do you think about Dragon Ball Daima? Are you excited about it? Are you kind of nervous about it? Do you feel like them turning them back into kids is a mistake? Are you optimistic about it? Are you cautiously optimistic? How do you feel? What are you saying? Send me an email at rockthedragonpodcast@gmail.com. I'm really, really excited to get back into having these conversations with you guys for the foreseeable future. You know, don't hold me to it yet. Obviously, numbers do matter when this kind of stuff is going on. For now, I'm going to assume I'll be around for the entire run of Dragon Ball Daima, but I don't know. If I put out 4 episodes and they get 12 streams apiece, I may not do a 5th episode at that point. But at least we're going to start off here. We're going to start off strong. So please bring your love, share your love, transfer all that love from the previous podcast, bring it over to this one so we can talk and we can have ourselves a good time once again. Guys, I think I'm all done here. I've said everything I have to say for this special introductory episode of Rock the Dragon, a Dragon Ball Daima podcast, episode 0. I'll see you guys next time very, very soon for episode 1 of the podcast, where we're going to dive into the actual show itself, and I'll have a review ready for you, and we can talk about it together the same way we did previously before. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your energy. I appreciate the good vibes. I appreciate all the people that have still reached out to me over the past couple years, even though the show itself had ended. Hope you guys join me in this new adventure. Okay, so that about does it for this episode of Rock the Dragon, a Dragon Ball Daima podcast. Once again, my name is Tim Bridgewater. I will see you guys in a couple days, and until then, keep on rocking the dragon.
Yeah.